For years, we were the couple people pointed to as a shining example of love and partnership. Emily, my wife, had a natural grace that made everyone adore her. She had this way of lighting up a room, her laugh as effortless as her charm. Meanwhile, I focused on the practical side of things, pouring my energy into creating a life where she felt supported and secure. I took pride in our home, a place that was supposed to be our sanctuary. On the surface, everything seemed perfect. But perfection has a way of blinding you to what's lurking beneath. At first, it was easy to dismiss the small changes. Emily came home one evening wearing a new perfume, something deeper and muskier than the light floral scents she usually favored. When I asked about it, she shrugged. "A colleague recommended it," she said with a smile, brushing past me to grab a glass of wine. I thought nothing of it at the time, but now, I can still recall the scent lingering in the air like a warning I failed to notice. Then came the late nights. Emily had always been diligent about her job, but suddenly, her work seemed to demand more of her time. "The team is swamped," she'd explain, her voice filled with exhaustion, though her eyes carried an energy I couldn't quite place. She assured me it was temporary, just until a big project was finished. I wanted to believe her, so I did. But as the weeks turned into months, my trust began to waver. She started carrying her phone with her everywhere, a habit she never had before. It was always in her hand or tucked into her pocket, as if letting it out of her sight was unthinkable. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I was imagining things. And then came the moment I couldn't ignore. It was a quiet evening. I'd come home earlier than usual, hoping to surprise her with dinner. But instead, I found her in the living room, absorbed in her phone. She didn't notice me at first, so I stood there for a moment, watching. She smiled. A soft, private smile I hadn't seen in years, and my chest tightened. "Who's that?" I asked casually, stepping into the room. Emily jumped slightly, her fingers quickly locking the screen. "Oh, just Sarah from work," she said with a laugh. Though her voice sounded a bit too high-pitched, her movements a little too quick, I tried to shrug it off, but the image of that smile stayed with me. The real blow came a week later. I was cleaning up the kitchen while Emily took a shower. Her phone, for once, was lying on the counter. It buzzed with a new message, lighting up the screen. I wasn't gonna look. Really, I wasn't. But my eyes caught the preview before I could stop myself. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Everything's ready." The words stared back at me, simple and unassuming, but they felt like a punch to the gut. My hands shook as I set down the dish I was holding. Who was this message from? What was ready? I told myself not to overreact. There could be a perfectly reasonable explanation. Emily was a social person. Maybe it was from a friend or a colleague. But deep down, I knew better. When she came back downstairs, I tried to act normal. My mind raced as she chatted about her day, her words washing over me without sinking in. I couldn't confront her, not yet. If I was wrong, I'd risk damaging something precious. But if I was right, I needed proof. The following day, Emily casually mentioned an upcoming work trip to Paris. She seemed excited, talking about meetings with clients and how important this trip was for her career. "It's only a few days," she said, flashing me a reassuring smile. "I'll miss you, though." I smiled back, but my heart wasn't in it. Something about the way she spoke felt rehearsed, too polished. As I helped her pack the night before her flight, I felt like an intruder in my own home, watching her with a mix of suspicion and heartbreak. That night, after she went to bed, I stayed up, grappling with my growing doubts. My thoughts circled back to that message, those 6 words that refused to leave my mind. I knew I couldn't ignore this anymore. The next morning, while Emily was busy getting ready, I downloaded a GPS tracking app onto her phone. I told myself it was temporary, just to ease my mind. If she wasn't hiding anything, I'd never have to use it. When she left for the airport, she kissed me on the cheek, her goodbye as warm as ever. "I'll call you when I land," she promised, her voice soft and steady. I nodded, watching her walk out the door, my heart heavy with guilt and dread. As soon as she was gone, I opened the app, staring at the blinking dot on the screen. My chest tightened as I realized there was no turning back now. If she was lying, I'd know soon enough. And if she wasn't, well, I'd live with the shame of doubting her. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was in control of my own life. All I could do was wait and brace myself for whatever came next. After Emily left for Paris, I spent the first few hours pacing the living room, staring at the blinking on my phone screen. Her location hadn't changed. She was still at the airport, just as she said she would be. It was mundane, ordinary, and yet I couldn't stop the uneasy churn in my stomach. Every passing second felt like an eternity as my mind raced, crafting theories and counter-theories, each one darker than the last. I knew I couldn't live like this. Watching the tracker obsessively wasn't going to bring me peace. It would only keep me trapped in this unbearable limbo. I needed answers, and I needed them in person. That's when the plan began to take shape. The first step was calling my boss. "I need some personal time," I told him, keeping my voice steady. A family matter came up. It wasn't entirely a lie, though the truth was far messier. To my surprise, he didn't ask for details. "Take care of what you need to," he said simply, and with that, I had cleared my schedule for the next week. The next step was booking a ticket to Paris. I knew I'd have to time everything carefully. If I arrived too soon or too late, I might miss my chance to confirm what I feared. My flight was set for 2 days after hers, a decision that left me in a state of agonizing anticipation. In the meantime, I forced myself to maintain the illusion of normalcy. I went through my daily routines with mechanical precision, running errands, answering emails, even cooking dinner for one. On the outside, I probably looked composed, but inside, I was a storm of emotions. Anger, fear, betrayal. They all battled for dominance, leaving me feeling raw and unsteady. When Emily called to check in, her voice was bright and casual. "I've landed safely," she said, a hint of excitement lacing her words. "The hotel is beautiful, and the first meeting went well." "That's great to hear," I replied, keeping my tone light. "I miss you already." "I miss you too," she said, and for a moment, I almost believed her. But as soon as the call ended, I opened the tracker app again, watching her dot move through the city. She had indeed gone to her hotel. Later, it showed her at a nearby cafe. Everything seemed normal, but that nagging feeling in my gut refused to quiet down. The night before my flight, I packed a small suitcase with clothes, my passport, and a notebook where I had scribbled down every suspicious detail I'd noticed over the past few weeks. It felt surreal, like I was preparing for a mission rather than a trip. When the day finally came, I arrived at the airport 2 hours early, unable to sit still at home any longer. As I waited to board, I stared at the tracker app, memorizing Emily's every movement. That morning, she had left the hotel and gone to a park. By the time my plane took off, she was back at the hotel again. The flight to Paris was excruciatingly long. I tried distracting myself with movies and books, but my mind kept drifting back to the what-ifs. What if I was wrong? What if I was right? What if seeing the truth broke me in ways I couldn't recover from? We landed just as the sun was setting, the golden light casting a romantic glow over the city, a cruel contrast to the turmoil I felt. After clearing customs, I hailed a cab and gave the driver the address of Emily's hotel. The streets of Paris were a blur as we weaved through traffic. The cab smelled faintly of cigarettes and lavender, a combination that would have amused me under different circumstances. But all I could think about was the blinking dot on my phone screen. Emily was still at the hotel, her location unchanged since the afternoon. I checked in to a modest hotel a few blocks away, choosing it for its proximity rather than comfort. After dropping off my suitcase, I stepped out into the crisp evening air, the sounds of the city buzzing around me. My heart raced as I stood across the street from Emily's hotel, staring at its glowing facade. It was there that I spotted her for the first time. She stepped out of the hotel, her figure wrapped in a coat, her hair swept back elegantly. She looked radiant, just as she always did, but seeing her through this lens of suspicion made my stomach twist. I followed at a safe distance as she walked down the street, her steps unhurried. She turned into a small restaurant, one with warm lighting and an intimate atmosphere. I lingered outside, peering through the window, and my heart sank as I watched her sit at a table for two. Minutes later, a man joined her. He was tall, with dark hair and an easy smile. The way he greeted her, leaning in slightly, his hand brushing her arm, was too familiar, too comfortable. I snapped a photo with my phone, my hands trembling as I tried to focus the camera. My chest felt tight, my breath shallow. They laughed, their heads leaning closer together as they spoke. I couldn't hear them, but their body language told me everything I needed to know. I couldn't confront her, not yet. I needed more. My hands clenched into fists as I turned and walked back to my hotel. The image of them burned into my mind. The next day, I would gather more evidence. But tonight, I sat alone in my room, staring at the photo on my phone, my world crumbling piece by piece. The morning air in Paris carried a chill as I stood across the street from Emily's hotel, sipping a coffee that had long gone cold. The grandeur of the building, with its ornate balconies and softly glowing windows, felt like a cruel joke. It was the perfect setting for a romantic getaway, just not one that included me. My heart pounded as I entered the lobby, the opulence of the space doing little to calm my nerves. Crystal chandeliers hung above, and the scent of fresh flowers filled the air. The concierge glanced at me politely as I walked past the front desk, trying to blend in. I wasn't sure what my plan was. I only knew I couldn't leave without answers. I took a seat in one of the plush armchairs in the lobby, my eyes glued to the elevator doors. The GPS tracker on Emily's phone showed she was still in the hotel. I didn't know if she was alone, and the thought made my stomach churn. Minutes turned into an hour, each tick of the grand clock on the wall feeling like a hammer against my chest. I rehearsed what I'd say to her, running through every scenario in my mind. Would she deny it, cry, beg for forgiveness? Or would she confirm my worst fears with cold indifference? The elevator chimed, and my breath hitched. Emily stepped out, radiant as ever in a fitted black dress and heels that clicked softly against the marble floor. She was engrossed in her phone, her lips curved in a faint smile, the same smile I'd seen when she read that message weeks ago. Emily. My voice cut through the quiet hum of the lobby. She froze mid-step, her head snapping up to meet my gaze. For a moment, she didn't move, her eyes wide with shock. What are you doing here?" she stammered, clutching her phone like a lifeline. "I think you know," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. Her expression shifted rapidly, from shock to confusion, then to something resembling panic. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, the elevator doors chimed again. Out stepped a man. He was tall and sharply dressed, his dark hair slicked back with a casual elegance. He carried himself with an air of confidence that turned my simmering anger into a full-blown inferno. "Emily," he called out, his tone easy and familiar as he approached her. His steps faltered when he saw me standing there, his brows furrowing in confusion. "Who's this?" he asked, glancing between us. I didn't wait for an introduction. "I'm her husband," I said, my words cutting through the tension like a knife. The color drained from Emily's face. "It's not what you think," she began, her voice trembling. She reached for my arm, but I pulled away, my gaze locked on the man beside her. "And who are you?" I demanded, taking a step closer to him. He hesitated, clearly weighing his options. "I'm a colleague," he said finally, his tone defensive. "A colleague," I echoed, the word dripping with disdain. "Colleagues don't meet in Parisian hotels and share intimate dinners." "It's not like that," Emily interjected, her voice rising. "Please, just let me explain." "Explain what?" I snapped, cutting her off. "That you've been lying to me for months? That you've been sneaking around with him while I stayed home building a life for us?" The man raised his hands in a placating gesture. "Look, I think we should all calm down," he said, his tone infuriatingly measured. But his calm demeanor only fueled my rage. "Calm down," I spat. "You've been sleeping with my wife, and you think I should calm down?" He opened his mouth to respond, but I didn't give him the chance. My fist connected with his jaw before I could think better of it, the force sending him stumbling backward into a nearby table. Glasses shattered as the table tipped over, drawing gasps from the handful of onlookers in the lobby. "Stop!" Emily screamed, rushing between us as I moved toward him again. She grabbed my arm, her eyes brimming with tears. "Please stop. This isn't who you are." "Who I am?" I yelled, shaking her off. "Who I am is a man who trusted his wife, who believed in her, only to be made a fool of." The man groaned as he pushed himself up, wiping blood from the corner of his mouth. "You're crazy," he muttered, glaring at me. "Say another word," I warned, my fists clenched at my sides. "Enough," Emily cried, her voice breaking. "Please, just let me explain." I turned to her, my chest heaving. "Explain what, Emily? That this was just a misunderstanding? That you didn't mean for it to happen? That it's somehow my fault?" Tears streamed down her face, but I couldn't bring myself to care. The pain, the betrayal, it was all consuming. I stepped back, running a hand through my hair as the weight of the situation crashed over me. "I can't do this," I said finally, my voice hoarse. "I can't even look at you right now." Without another word, I turned and walked out of the hotel, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. I didn't stop walking until I was far enough away that the sounds of the city drowned out the chaos in my mind. I had my answer now, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the end of everything I thought I knew. The cold Parisian air bit at my skin as I walked aimlessly through the streets, the world around me a blur. My hands were trembling, whether from anger, shame, or the adrenaline still coursing through my veins, I couldn't say. Every step away from that hotel felt heavier, as if I were carrying the weight of a life I no longer recognized. I kept replaying the scene in my mind, like a broken record I couldn't turn off. Emily's tearful pleas, the look on that man's face as I hit him, the way she had called out my name in a voice that once made me feel safe. Now it only filled me with bitterness. When I finally stopped walking, I found myself near the Seine, the city lights reflecting off the water in shimmering patterns. I sank onto a bench, my head in my hands. What had gone wrong? How had we ended up here, in this tangled mess of lies and betrayal? I'd been proud of our marriage, of the life we'd built together. And yet, somewhere along the way we had drifted apart, and I hadn't even seen it happening. Or maybe I had, but I had ignored it, too afraid to confront the cracks in our foundation. Now the truth was unavoidable, and it felt like a knife twisting in my chest. I pulled out my phone and booked the next flight home, a red-eye that left in just a few hours. I couldn't stand to be in this city any longer, not when every corner seemed to mock me with its romantic charm. At the airport, I moved like a ghost through security and the boarding process, my mind consumed by a whirlwind of emotions. The plane was barely half full, and I sank into a window seat, grateful for the solitude. As the engines roared to life and the plane ascended into the night sky, I stared out at the twinkling lights below, the city growing smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely. That should have brought some relief, but it didn't. I sat in silence, the hum of the plane the only sound as my thoughts spiraled. Anger flared up first, hot and all-consuming. How dare she? After everything we'd been through, after everything I'd sacrificed to make her happy, how could she betray me like this? Then came the shame. I felt like a fool for not seeing it sooner, for letting myself believe we were still the perfect couple. I thought back to all the times I had dismissed the warning signs, the late nights, the new perfume, the message on her phone. How could I have been so blind? And finally, the sadness settled in, heavy and suffocating. I had loved Emily with every fiber of my being. She wasn't just my wife. She was my partner, my confidant, the person I thought I'd grow old with. Losing her felt like losing a part of myself, and I didn't know how to move forward. When I landed back home, the first thing I did was call my brother, Michael. He answered on the second ring, his voice groggy. "Hey, everything okay? It's pretty early." "No," I said, my voice cracking. "It's not." Michael didn't ask questions, not right away. "Come over," he said simply. I drove to his house, my hands gripping the wheel tightly as I tried to keep my emotions in check. When I arrived, Michael was waiting for me at the door, his face etched with concern. "What happened?" he asked, pulling me into a hug. I told him everything. The tracker, the trip to Paris, the confrontation at the hotel. As the words spilled out, I felt a strange mix of relief and pain, like lancing a wound to let the poison out. Michael listened without interrupting, his brow furrowing as I finished. "You did what you had to do," he said finally. "But you can't stay stuck in this. You need to focus on what comes next." He was right, of course. I couldn't change what had happened, but I could take control of what came next. The following morning, I reached out to a lawyer, a family friend who specialized in divorce cases. When I explained the situation, she didn't seem surprised. If anything, she seemed determined. "We'll get through this," she assured me. "But you need to stay strong. Gather any documentation you can, proof of the affair, financial records, anything that might be relevant." I spent the rest of the day sorting through emails, bank statements, and messages, trying to piece together the evidence I needed. Each new piece of information felt like another blow, but I pushed through it, knowing that this was the first step toward rebuilding my life. That night, as I lay in the guest room at Michael's house, I stared at the ceiling, exhaustion pulling at me but sleep refusing to come. My mind kept returning to Emily, not to the betrayal but to the good times, the moments when we were happy. I realized then that moving forward wouldn't just mean letting go of her. It would mean letting go of the life I thought we had, the future I had envisioned. It was a daunting thought, but for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead would be long and painful, but it was mine to walk, and I would walk it one step at a time. The process of filing for divorce felt both surreal and inevitable. My lawyer, Karen, guided me through every step, her tone firm but compassionate. She made it clear that the evidence I had gathered, the tracker logs, the messages, and the photos, would play a critical role in securing a fair outcome. "The first step is serving her the papers," Karen explained during one of our meetings. "It'll be hard, but it's important to establish boundaries. Don't let her manipulate you." Manipulation was something I was starting to expect from Emily. In the days following my return from Paris, she called incessantly, leaving voicemail after voicemail. At first, her tone was desperate, pleading. "Please, let's talk," she begged in one message. "I can explain everything. It's not what you think." When I didn't respond, the tone of her messages shifted to anger. "You're really going to throw everything away because of one mistake?" she snapped in another voicemail. "You're being ridiculous." I ignored them all, funneling my energy into preparing for the divorce. The papers were delivered by a process server, and I got a text from Emily within minutes. "Seriously? You couldn't even talk to me first?" I didn't reply. The first time we met in person after Paris was during a court-mandated mediation session. Emily looked composed, almost defiant, as if she expected to walk in and sway me with a few well-chosen words. But the moment she saw the evidence Karen presented, the photos, the tracker logs, her composure cracked. Her defense was as predictable as it was infuriating. "It was just a fling," she said, her voice trembling. "It didn't mean anything." I stared at her, trying to reconcile the woman sitting across from me with the person I thought I had married. "You destroyed our marriage for something that didn't mean anything?" I asked, my voice heavy with disbelief. Emily looked away, her hands twisting in her lap. "I was lonely," she muttered. "You were so busy with work. I felt invisible." Her words stung, but they didn't justify what she'd done. "If you were unhappy, you could have told me," I said, my voice rising. "You didn't have to lie. You didn't have to cheat." The mediator stepped in, urging us to stay civil. But the damage was done. The divorce dragged on for months, each step more draining than the last. Emily tried to contest my claims, arguing that I was overreacting and that she deserved more than what Karen and I offered in the settlement. But the evidence was undeniable, and eventually, she had no choice but to concede. When the divorce was finalized, I felt a strange mix of relief and emptiness. The chapter was closed, but the scars remained. The first few weeks after the divorce were the hardest. I moved out of the house we had shared, unable to bear the memories etched into every corner. I stayed with my brother Michael for a while before finding a small apartment on the other side of town. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I threw myself into work, taking on extra projects to fill the hours and distract myself from the ache in my chest. At first, it felt like I was just going through the motions, but slowly, I began to find a rhythm. Friends and family rallied around me, pulling me out of my shell and encouraging me to reconnect with the world. Michael introduced me to his hiking group, and I found solace in the steady climb of the trails and the peace of the open air. Therapy also became a lifeline. Talking to someone who could help me untangle my emotions was cathartic, and over time, I started to see the pieces of myself I thought I had lost. And then there was Emily. I'd heard bits and pieces through mutual friends. How her life began to unravel after the divorce. The man she had been seeing in Paris? He ghosted her not long after I confronted them. The affair that had cost her our marriage turned out to be nothing more than a fleeting dalliance for him. Her work suffered, too. The whispers of her personal life started to circulate among her colleagues, and her once pristine reputation was tarnished. Eventually, she quit her job, unable to face the judgment. Mutual friends told me she tried reaching out to them, but many of them had sided with me. What she did was awful, one friend said. We couldn't support her after that. One evening, Emily showed up at my apartment unannounced. Her face was pale, her eyes puffy from crying. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice trembling. I hesitated, but ultimately stepped outside, keeping the door firmly closed behind me. "I've made mistakes," she began, tears streaming down her face. "I know I hurt you, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But, can we start over? Please?" Her words hit me like a wave, but this time I didn't falter. "No, Emily," I said firmly. "You made your choices. Now you have to live with them. I've moved on." Her shoulders sagged, and for the first time, she looked truly defeated. Without another word, she turned and walked away. Today, my life feels lighter, freer. I've reconnected with old hobbies, made new friends, and even started dating again. Slowly, cautiously. Each step forward feels like reclaiming a part of myself that I thought was gone forever. Emily's downfall was a reminder of the consequences of her actions, but I've stopped letting her choices define my life. The scars are still there, but they no longer weigh me down. I'm building something new now, and for the first time in a long time I feel hopeful. Support the channel by subscribing. It really makes a difference.